Okay, we are on our next to last chapter, chapter 16, and this chapter talks about identification procedures. So, identifications obviously are very critical to police work. We're looking for victims to identify suspects or witnesses to identify them. And there's three basic types used: lineups, show-ups, and photographic lineups. They're also called photo arrays. Lineups are probably what you're most familiar with. Multiple people are brought in a single group with one suspect, and it's shown to the witness, and the witness is asked to identify the suspect. A show-up is when a single suspect is shown to the witness, and a photo array is multiple photos are shown to the witness. Now, that could be done like a lineup, with all the photos at once, or in sequential order. So we cannot compel a suspect to participate in a lineup unless they are without their consent or without them being in custody. Brief detentions for a show-up may be possible, but generally we're looking for probable cause to transport someone for a lineup. Remember, the Fourth Amendment applies to any detention. Photo lineups, however, are not a detention. We're not actually detaining a person. There's no right to refuse to participate in the lineup if you are in custody, and you can be compelled to pose a certain way, wear specific clothes, or speak specific words. So in U.S. v. Wade from 1967, Billy Joe Wade was arrested for a bank robbery. He had counsel appointed to represent him, and he was compelled to appear in a lineup without counsel being present. During this lineup, he's identified as the robber. On appeal, the Supreme Court said counsel must be present or it may constitute a violation of the Sixth Amendment, but not necessarily the Fifth Amendment. So it's more about his right to counsel than it was to his right against self-incrimination. So generally, a suspect doesn't have the right to have counsel present during a lineup, but after arrest, counsel may be present. So counsel does not run the lineup. Counsel observes the conditions and may object to admission of identification if it violates due process. But that's a procedure that would take place in front of the judge. In Kirby v. Illinois, William Shard was robbed by two men. Police stopped Kirby, who was arrested and taken to the station. In a show-up, Shard identified Kirby as the man. This was not a violation of the Sixth Amendment right to counsel because the show-up occurred before the beginning of a criminal prosecution. In Moore v. Illinois, Moore was arrested for rape. The victim was shown Moore after hearing evidence of his guilt. And at trial, she testified the identification was made in part based upon the information that the prosecution had given her about his guilt. Supreme Court said that this violates the right to counsel and is improperly suggestive. So one thing that we have to have during identification procedures are what's known as procedural due process. And this is the requirement that whatever method is used is fair, cannot create a bias against a suspect, or unduly suggest to the person trying to make the identification which party is guilty or that the party is guilty. When we have a lineup, the individuals must have similar characteristics as well. So let's look at these two lineups, right? The top one has similar characteristics. The bottom one is unduly suggestive, right? There's probably two women in the lineup. People are dressed very differently. In Foster v. California, Foster is accused of robbing a Western Union. And in the first lineup, Foster, who was 6 feet tall, was in a lineup with two smaller men. And the witness had also been shown Foster alone. Later in a second lineup, the witness was shown Foster and 4 different men. The Supreme Court held the difference in possible suspects, the show-up, and the repeated viewing were unnecessarily suggestive. So because she's seen him twice, and the victim has seen, or the witness rather, has seen Foster, who is significantly taller than the other people, it's unduly suggestive. So, in each lineup, we should only have one suspect. All the fillers, the non-suspects, should be physically similar to the suspect. Each time you do it, you need to rotate where the suspect is and use a minimum of 4 fillers. When you have new suspects, you have to use new fillers. The fillers don't have to be uniformly similar to the suspect, but any unique characteristics should be copied. Now, the emerging trend in some states is what's called sequential lineups, and this seems to eliminate false identifications. So what happens is a police officer who is unconnected with the case is given the photographs, okay? One of which is the suspect, and the officer doesn't know who the suspect is, so they can't even, inadvertently give any clues as to who the suspect is. And then they're shown them in sequence, and they're asked each time, to identify whether or not that person is the suspect. So if witnesses see more than one lineup or photographic lineup, that starts to create problems. So we should use blank lineups with no suspects to prevent misidentification. We should keep witnesses separate from each other and not coach them, and make a detailed report on the result of all lineups. You can modify photos to conform to the suspect, though. Show-ups are innately suggestive, right? Because we're showing someone one person. So we want to make sure that we prevent misidentification. These are usually limited, or in the past they've been limited to emergency situations. So you have a witness who's injured or dying, and you bring the suspect in custody right there to them. Is this the person you saw? If, however, it meets due process guidelines, they are permissible now. So in Nail v. Biggers, Biggers is accused of rape, and the victim was shown photographs but did not identify the defendant. After 7 months, she was invited to a show-up where the defendant was asked to say, "Shut up or I will kill you," and she identified him. The lower courts dismissed it as too suggestive. The Supreme Court upheld the identification, though, and said it was not too suggestive. So things we want to consider with a show-up. First of all, did the witness have the opportunity to view the crime? And what degree of attention were they paying to the events? How certain are they? How closely prior identifications conform to the current suspect? We also want to think about the type and extent of prior inaccuracies in that witness's identification, the length of time between the crime and the lineup, and the court is going to look at all of the circumstances to judge whether or not due process has occurred. At trial, witnesses are frequently requested to make an identification, and the prosecution often attempts to focus on the accuracy of its witnesses, whereas the defense wants to show you probably misidentified them, focusing on things like whether or not the person could really see, if their eyesight is okay, do they have a poor memory, and occasionally expert witnesses might be called. If a constitutional issue is raised about an identification, they have to hold a hearing about it in camera, right? So that means in the judge's chambers, or there's an automatic reversal. And fruit of the poisonous tree applies to in-court identifications. What if you have problems with witnesses? If the witness does not remember, they may still testify that they identified the witness in the pretrial lineup, but then you can obviously make an attack upon the credibility of the witness if they can't remember the person now at trial. In U.S. v. Owens, Foster was attacked and suffered injuries, including an injury to his memory. Before trial, he had identified Owens as his attacker, but by the time trial came around, he didn't have any memory. And the Supreme Court said the pretrial identification could be admitted. And that wraps up identification procedures.